Silent Hill 2 is a game that is known for being sexy. Before I ever played, I knew of two images associated with this series: busty nurses in short skirts and a chain door. When I actually played, I was met with a large man wielding his even larger appendage as one of the main antagonists, and a woman using sensuality as a psychological weapon to manipulate the main character as the other. Although I'd say the sexiest thing you can experience in this game is actually this guitar riff. While these things have become incredibly iconic, they were not the reasons it became my favorite game series. Sexuality I realized as merely a vehicle to tell the story of characters that, like sex, are not clearly nor definitively good or bad, but rather are crafted with the depth, contradictions, and psychological complexity that exists in real people. I know I'm not the only one who felt this with the game when I played it, because while this game was released in 2001, it's still sparking discussions nearly 25 years later. One of these questions is why Silent Hill 2 seems to be a completely independent story to the other core games, and why it takes such a dramatic and carnal turn with its monsters. While it doesn't explicitly mention characters from the first game, I do think you're able to connect it thematically because sex is associated with another very important hallmark of Silent Hill: religion. I wanted to dig into the game's most thematically important ideas, including sex and religion, and through that research, I think I may have also stumbled into a clearer understanding of what Pyramid Head actually represents, beyond just the guilt and terror lurking inside James. But to get there, we're going to have to get uncomfortably close to James himself. Yeah, we're gonna get into his pants, I guess. Before we go any further, this video essay contains spoilers for the first 4 Silent Hill games, as those are the entries that I drew from and treated as canon for this analysis. We open the game with a letter from Mary, the deceased wife of James Sunderland.
In my restless dreams, I see that town. Silent Hill.
She is a woman who spent years bedridden with a terminal illness that left both her and James frustrated, lonely, and lashing out in ways that they both eventually regretted. When he goes to Silent Hill, he's repressed to the resentment and helplessness that had built up over the years that she was sick, in the hopes of finding her there, alive. Who James meets in the town, however, is Maria, a facsimile of his wife, who is physically identical, yet her demeanor and style are unmistakably different. She is more sexually extroverted in both her clothing and personality, and the game suggests that Maria was born from James's wish to see Mary again, along with other hidden wishes that he had harbored. This manifestation is made possible by the town's ancient religion, which set the stage for other dimensions to intersect with reality, enabling desires and fears to take shape in realms like the Otherworld and the Fog World. This religion is run by a cult organization called the Order, which has a syncretic belief system, meaning that it blends various influences like paganism, Christianity, and Mesoamerican rituals. It most likely arose due to the history surrounding the town, with the land once belonging to the indigenous people that considered Silent Hill to be sacred until the immigration of European settlers in the 1600s to 1800s brought disease and Christianity. The Order is not a native religion that existed prior to Silent Hill's colonization, but instead, what likely happened is that some traditions and beliefs were adopted by the Christian settlers, which helped to aid in the conversion of native people to Christianity, similarly to how Christian holidays fall on pagan festivals. Furthermore, any supernatural phenomena or deities that they might have encountered were described using names and terminology already familiar with their own culture. While I think real-world context can be useful for shaping the story and grounding it in something familiar, it's also much simpler to say that this is confirmed by a book found in the Chapel's library in Silent Hill 3 called Silent Hill's Ancient Gods, a study of their etymology and evolution. It reads, "There is no religion that has remained unchanged from the moment it was founded. This one is no exception. When this religion fell into the hands of immigrants, it was deeply influenced by their own original Christian beliefs. For example, the traditional representatives of these primal gods may be given the names and descriptions of Christian angels. Thus, shared characteristics begin to appear." When I saw this page, this image instantly made me think of Mary. I wasn't sure why she specifically would appear in a historical source for the Order, and I thought I might have finally found a connection we were looking for to Silent Hill 2, but later information complicates this reading. Masahiro Ito explained that he had only 2 days to design God in Silent Hill 3, and in doing so he reused Mary's face along with Pyramid Head's arms. Knowing this, it becomes difficult to build a theory that treats the image as deliberate iconography rather than partly a product of time constraints. Still, I don't think the resemblance is completely meaningless, given that the adjacent passage explicitly discusses the symbolic use of familiar Christian names. It's more reasonable to read this image as a subtle acknowledgement of the symbolic weight carried by the name Mary in Silent Hill 2, rather than as a literal depiction or a fully intentional parallel. The Virgin Mary is one of the most prominent women in religious texts, appearing in the New Testament as a virginal girl who became the mother of Jesus, conceiving him through the Holy Spirit without intercourse. She is known under many titles, including Virgin Mary, Blessed Virgin Mary, Saint Mary, Mother of God, Theotokos, Madonna or Our Lady, and Queen of Heaven, the latter which had previously been used for goddesses such as Isis and Ishtar. Christian traditions, especially Catholic, Orthodox, and some Anglican branches, hold that Mary remained a virgin before, during, and after Jesus' birth, a doctrine known as her perpetual virginity. The earliest surviving textual assertion of Mary's perpetual virginity comes from the 2nd century Gospel of James, which recounts her miraculous conception, upbringing, marriage to Joseph, and the journey to Bethlehem, Jesus' birth, and events immediately following. Despite being condemned by Pope Innocent I in 405 and later classified as apocryphal, this gospel became an influential source for Mariology, shaping the theological understanding of Mary's unique spiritual and moral status in both Christian devotion and doctrine. The text is named for its claimed author, James, who is identified as the brother of Jesus from an earlier marriage of Joseph. Mary's virginity became an important theological symbol of purity, obedience to God, and spiritual integrity. Throughout history, religious emphasis on chastity and sexual restraint reinforced moral and social expectations, shaping ideas about a woman's role. Mary embodies a paradox. She is both virgin and natural mother, a combination impossible in human terms. Yet this becomes the standard for veneration and moral exemplar in Christian culture. As one of the most prominent positively received women in the Bible, her sexual purity and moral virtue become closely intertwined, influencing the concept of womanhood in Christian societies for centuries. There is one woman in Silent Hill who I would say symbolically represents this character in the Bible, having the same name and thematic importance. Conflating Mary Sunderland to the Virgin Mary may seem confusing at first, given her marriage to James and the unlikelihood of her remaining a virgin. In case you didn't know, sex is only considered biblically sinful if it's outside of marriage or adulterous. I would argue, however, that her image and memory reflect the biblical ideal of feminine purity in the early 1990s context of the game. She seems modest, gentle, quiet, and guided by maternal instincts when we first are introduced to her. Most of this is based on the photo James carries throughout the game, along with the letters and the conversations with Laura, who also knew Mary. I will note that these do feel like, and intentionally on my part, very shallow assumptions of her character. We know her illness made her irritable and prone to sudden anger towards James and the people around her, which is far from gentle or quiet. From an outside perspective, however, the way she presents herself plays directly into cultural expectations and cues. Her clothing, posture, and gentle smile evoke a familiar traditional ideal of a wife and mother. If you strip away the human complexity and look at it like an advertisement or a piece of branding, her image alone is crafted in a way that signals virtue, domesticity, and reliability. It reinforces the common idea of what a good wife is meant to be, even though her real experiences and behavior no longer, or maybe never did, match that ideal. Mary also wanted children, but her terminal illness prevented her from doing so biologically. She expressed a desire to adopt Laura, which in a sense would have allowed her to have a child while celibate. Laura, who I speculate to be one of the orphans from Wish House, could theoretically have been sent to the town to comfort Mary or fulfill her longing for a child, even if only temporarily. This longing is even reflected in Maria, the manifestation of Mary. In the Born from a Wish DLC, while the title of this DLC refers to Mary being born from James's wish, it may carry a dual meaning here since the term born is primarily associated with the process of childbirth and the orphanage in Silent Hill being called Wish House. James's primary wish was to see Mary again, but before her illness, he very likely shared the wish with Mary to have a normal family life. If that's the case, both Mary and Laura could have come from his wish alone, especially if you're assuming that Mary's own intentions no longer influenced Silent Hill. In this sense, the title subtly reinforces, even if weakly, Mary's association with the theme of birth and implies that Mary's wish could have brought Laura to Silent Hill, or the town manipulated circumstances to ensure her meeting the Sunderlands. Considering that Mary's letter to James gradually disappears over the course of the story, it isn't impossible that her letter to Laura might also possess some supernatural qualities. It's also worth noting that Mary intended the letter for Laura's 8th birthday, but since Laura apparently took it early, she is likely 7, a number with deep symbolic significance in religion. 7, while representing completeness and spiritual perfection, can also represent the fulfillment of God's promises, such as the sevenfold blessing. In this context, Laura being 7 could symbolize the fulfillment of Mary's wish for a child, reinforcing the spiritual and symbolic weight of Mary's maternal influence. This symbolism could also provide a deeper explanation for Laura's presence in the fog world, without needing to cast her as another projection of James's psyche, and why she experiences the town as relatively normal despite her occasional mean-spirited remarks. While I will recognize that adoption is not equivalent to the miraculous conception of Jesus described in the Bible, this idea creates a symbolic parallel. Through supernatural circumstances allowed for by the town, Mary could experience a form of motherhood without compromising her own sexual purity to become a mother, echoing the way Mary, mother of Jesus, bore a child through divine means. In dissecting what her name could represent, it would be wrong not to note the symbolic weight of Mary's last names as well, though for now I just want to look at her maiden name, Shepherd, which evokes the literal and metaphorical role of a shepherd, one who leads, protects, and cares for a flock, guiding them to safety and defending them from harm. In biblical context, it also directly recalls Jesus as the Good Shepherd, a figure who not only tends to his people, but is willing to lay down his life for them. This imagery appears throughout the scripture, from the Old Testament figures like Moses and David, who were literal shepherds, to the New Testament passages where Jesus describes himself and God as divine shepherds responsible for the guidance, protection, and care of humanity. The metaphor of the shepherd is central to understanding Mary's role in Silent Hill 2, particularly through the biblical parable of the sheep and the goats. In this parable, the shepherd separates the flock based on their actions. The sheep are those who show compassion and charity, while the goats fail to do so, highlighting specific failures that lead to condemnation, including those who neglect the hungry, the thirsty, the imprisoned, or the sick. This separation represents God's final judgment, a moral reckoning that evaluates each individual's worthiness. In Silent Hill 2, James's journey is mirrored in this moral framework, with the game's ending depending in part on how he treats both himself and Maria. His failure to care for Mary towards the end of her life, a lapse that fuels his guilt and presumably her anger, places her in the role of both judge and guide, deciding his fate based on his actions. This parable also mirrors James's psychological struggle. He is metaphorically a sheep, vulnerable and easily scattered, yet this extends beyond the parable. James cannot exist without his shepherd, Mary, who guided him both in life and now within the reality of Silent Hill. While he was her caretaker, she remained the one who cared for him in moments of loss, confusion, or need for structure, even after she's dead, emphasizing her role as moral compass and an emotional anchor. Mary, however, isn't the one in Silent Hill literally shepherding him. That role belongs to Maria, the facsimile. That said, I would argue that they really are just two sides of the same coin. Maria is far more sexually expressive than Mary and is shown to work as a dancer at Heaven's Night, a strip club actually with a paradoxical name since night doesn't exist in heaven. Evidence includes a poster reading Return of Lady Maria in Silent Hill 3 and her own room in the Born from a Wish DLC. The connection between Maria, Mary, and the Virgin Mary is further strengthened by the fact that Madonna is an Italian phrase meaning Our Lady, which is frequently used to refer to the Virgin Mary. However, I don't think Maria embodies the same archetype here. Looking closer, she actually resonates more strongly with a different Mary from the Bible. The other Mary that emerges in the New Testament is one of Jesus' most devoted followers. Mary Magdalene is repeatedly mentioned among the women who accompanied and supported his ministry, even providing financial backing, and she is present at both his crucifixion and burial. She played a critical role among his female disciples, yet relatively little is known about her life. The scarcity of information unfortunately reflects the cultural norms of the time. Women were often discouraged from from speaking publicly and holding leadership positions, which naturally limited both the quantity and accuracy of stories recorded about them. Gnostic texts, such as the Gospel of Mary from the 2nd to 3rd century CE, portray additional tensions around her authority. In these writings, Peter questions whether Jesus would have spoken privately with a woman and whether others should listen to her, at times asserting that women are quote-unquote not worthy of the life or should not teach. Although Gnostic texts were non-canonical because they conflicted with emerging Orthodox theology by challenging both doctrinal norms and gender hierarchies, these surviving writings reveal debates in early Christian communities over a woman's role. Despite such challenges, Mary Magdalene is consistently portrayed as one of Jesus' closest and most beloved disciples, being someone who truly understood his teachings. The Gospel of Philip also highlights her proximity and closeness with Jesus, noting there were three who always walked with the Lord: Mary, his mother, her sister, and Mary Magdalene, who was called his companion. His sister, his mother, and his companion were each a Mary. When I first read this passage, I couldn't help but think of the common phrase used to evoke empathy in men considering violence against women. She could be your mother, your sister, your daughter, or your wife. The second thought that came to mind was the number 3 itself, a deeply significant number in Christianity, often associated with the Holy Trinity. While this passage was surely not intended to suggest a divine feminine trinity, it does present a striking pattern. These 3 Marys represent 3 socially recognized and accepted roles a woman can occupy in society. These observations are definitely more speculative and symbolic than historically grounded, but interesting nonetheless, and in the context of Silent Hill, considering the 3 women directly tied to James. In part due to the fact that she is called his companion in the passage, some modern theologians and writers have speculated controversially that this might imply Magdalene was his wife. Critics of this have noted that the translation of this word, the word for companion, can also mean partner or associate. While I am not claiming whether these theories are historically accurate, they carry symbolic weight, with Mary as a secret or hidden lover that could have been obscured by history to maintain the association of holiness with celibacy, since sex was not considered a sin in marriage, reinforcing the link between spiritual purity and sexual restraint. Considering that one long-standing theory suggests James may have struggled with secret sexual desires or an affair during Mary's illness, it becomes interesting to see Maria as a potential representation of this secret lover archetype that Magdalene has been speculated to embody. In addition to those mentions, Mary Magdalene's story was mischaracterized nearly 6 centuries later by Pope Gregory I's 591 sermon, in which he conflated Mary with several unnamed women in the Gospels, most notably the sinful woman who anoints Jesus' feet in Luke 7:36-50, and the woman caught in adultery in John 7:53 to 8:11. This was the origin of the common belief that Mary was a repentant prostitute, when in fact the biblical texts never portray her as such. This interpretation significantly shaped Western Christian views of her for centuries, despite lacking textual support. The Gospels themselves provide a different picture. In Luke 8:1-3, it introduces Mary as from whom 7 demons had gone out, and lists her among women who materially supported Jesus' ministry alongside Joanna, Susanna, and others. Pope Gregory's homily later interpreted these 7 demons as the 7 cardinal sins, including lust, but in first century Jewish context, demons often refer to physical, psychological, or spiritual afflictions rather than moral failings, and the number 7 symbolized completeness and perfection in Jewish tradition, seen in the 7 days of creation, the Sabbath on the 7th day, and other ritual and symbolic uses, suggesting the possibility that Mary's experience represented total healing rather than the literal casting out of 7 demons. Scholars James Crossley and Robert Miles, in Jesus, A Life in Class Conflict, argue that the gospel term sinner was often not sexual transgressors, but in response to the class struggles and social conflicts at the time, suggesting that Mary's sin may have been her wealth itself. While the source of her wealth is unknown, it could have involved profit at the expense of others or corrupted her behavior, consistent with the biblical warning that, quote, the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. From this perspective, the 7 demons may symbolize Mary's deliberate relinquishing of her wealth to support Jesus' work. Rather than a social outcast, she emerges as an affluent woman actively engaged in the network sustaining the early Christian movement, demonstrating that Jesus' message reached beyond the poor to challenge the wealthy to exchange material power for generosity, stewardship, and ethical responsibility. Unfortunately, the rationale of relinquishing wealth has often been applied exclusively to women, regardless of original intent, framing the surrender of her independent resources, whether to the church or to a husband, as a measure of devotion to God. Mary's prominence in the narrative and her stark contrast with the more stereotyped portrayals of other women may have served to reinforce expectations of voluntary renunciation of wealth, sexual restraint, and religious devotion. All of this brings me back to our so-called repentant prostitute, Maria. At first glance, it's easy to draw parallels between her and Mary Magdalene. Both were at least accused of prostitution and possessed independence and strong wills that set them apart from other women of their time. The games reinforce this connection through her association with Heaven's Knight, presenting Maria as a figure shaped by desire, danger, and moral ambiguity. In doing so, she becomes an intentional echo of the long-standing cultural image of Mary Magdalene. Magdalene also had 7 demons cast out of her, which in ancient contexts likely referred to physical or psychological afflictions rather than literal demonic possession. With that in mind, we meet Maria, appearing healthy and energetic and unburdened by any visible decline. One could argue that she represents a healed or idealized Mary, free from suffering, limitations, and the emotional weight of her past, or even represents James's temporary escape from the burden of his own memories and sins. In this sense, the contrast between Mary's frailty and Maria's apparent wholeness echoes a biblical motif: the afflicted woman and the restored one. Maria, then, could be seen as the Mary who exists after the demons have been stripped away by James's wishful mind, or by the reincarnation by the gods of old Silent Hill. We'll get to that. Their eventual return mirrors the reappearance of those demons, the pain, guilt, and suffering that James has been trying, unsuccessfully, to bury. Structurally, within this narrative, too, we see less of Mary than Maria, reflecting the biblical dynamic in which Mary Magdalene is more present throughout Jesus' journey than the Virgin Mary, despite the latter's greater overall significance to Christianity. In Silent Hill 2, Mary exists primarily as a memory in James's mind, but she is arguably the most important character, serving as the catalyst for the entire story, the inciting incident for all that follows. Just as without the Virgin Mary there would be no Jesus, without Mary there would be no Silent Hill 2 for James. Maria, on the other hand, is the one who accompanies him throughout the journey, much like Mary Magdalene walking alongside Jesus.
Until, of course, she can no longer accompany him. If you've played through Silent Hill 2, you probably have a very strong memory of this scene after Pyramid Head skewers Maria. What you might not have known is that the song that plays directly after this is called Magdalene, or in the Silent Hill 2 remake, Magdalene's Tears. While some have speculated that the name of this song hints at her restorative powers and her resurrection later on, since Magdalene is the one who found Jesus at the tomb, I actually think that this is much stronger evidence that Maria is a representation of Mary Magdalene in our story.
Since Mary is a manifestation of James's mind, there is no clear distinction between her and Maria, as there is with the women in the Bible. Maria wouldn't exist without Mary as a blueprint. Everything we see is filtered through James's perspective, just as the monster abstract daddy is not the same as Angela experiences it. The real Mary was likely neither completely chaste nor overtly sexual, but somewhere in between, with her behavior influenced by life events like her relationship with James or her illness. This duality is evident in the Labyrinth jail cell, where Maria alternates between Mary's sweet, gentle tones and memories and Maria's more seductive voice. She is constantly concerned about Laura, a little girl who was Mary's friend during her hospitalization, and she shares Mary's desire for James's love. At one point, Maria coughs, swallows some pills, and rests on a bed, evoking Mary's illness. I'd even say when Maria says she looks like James's girlfriend rather than his wife, it may not just be a flirtation, but indicate that this version of Maria represents Mary as she was when James first met her, or when they were dating, potentially. This ambiguity makes it hard to separate Maria from Mary completely. Why separate the characters at all, though? I think one answer is that it adds to the liminality that is central to Silent Hill's themes, the real Mary being somewhere in between the two. I also believe that it serves to physically embody James's psyche when you consider a Freudian complex based on these two biblical women. The Madonna-Whore complex is a psychological phenomena in which a man struggles to maintain sexual arousal within a committed, loving relationship. It is said to develop in men who categorize women as either saintly Madonnas or debased whores. In this context, a man may desire a sexual partner only if she is perceived as degraded, a whore, while being unable to feel sexual desire towards a respected or revered partner, a Madonna. Freud argued that this split arises from the tensions between affectionate and sexual currents in male desire, often linked to Oedipal and castration anxieties. These fears prevent men from transferring affection for past incestuous objects to women that they desire sexually. To manage this anxiety, men categorize women into two groups, those that they can admire and those that they find sexually attractive. While they may love women in the first category, they often devalue or despise women in the second. It's thought that this complex arises not only from individual psychological development, but also from long-standing cultural and religious representations of women as either Madonnas or whores in mythology and Abrahamic theology. Remember that Madonna often refers to the Virgin Mary. She embodies the purity culture women are expected to uphold, while also literally serving as a mother in the narrative, which heightens the symbolic weight of the Oedipal fears central to this theory. Anything not virginal and maternal is then cast as a whore. When such rigid social distinctions are reinforced from adolescence, men are either forced to unlearn them later or never perceive women as existing anywhere between these two extremes. I believe it's not just possible, but highly likely that James experiences this conflict. He loved Mary deeply, yet by the end of her life he carried significant sexual repression and unspoken desires. Her puritanical qualities may have transformed her into a maternal archetype that made sexual desire difficult, regardless of the physical changes caused by her illness. On top of this, he took on the role of her caretaker, as one might care for a parent or child. Mary became both a responsibility and an image of a mother too strong for him to separate from desire. Maria, in contrast, represents the opposite pole, the whore. She is sexually outgoing, works a job that many, especially in the 1990s timeline, would consider degrading, and embodies the temptation that James cannot reconcile with his feelings for Mary. In James's psyche, Mary and Maria represent the two halves of the Madonna-Whore complex. He may not love Maria as he does Mary, he may even hate her because of her promiscuity, yet he is sexually attracted to her. Another factor worth considering is how monogamy, marriage, chastity norms, rigid gender roles, and the suppression of women's sexuality in many religious traditions historically functioned to ease men's fears of paternal uncertainty. Before modern genetics, men faced an evolutionary risk. If a partner had extramarital sex, they could end up investing resources in a child who wasn't biologically theirs. Some psychologists argue that this underlying anxiety contributes to the development of the Madonna-Whore complex, idealizing sexually pure women while distrusting those perceived as sexually available. Seen through that lens, Mary's interest in adopting Laura takes on an added layer of meaning. For a man already overwhelmed by caregiving, guilt, sexual frustration, and emotional distance, the prospect of raising a child who wasn't biologically his might have activated some of those deeper socially conditioned fears that likely fed into the development of this complex in him. James's own name actually hints at this theory. His last name, I would argue, though, is far more interesting to dissect. Sunderland is derived from Old English, and the name combines sunder, meaning apart or separate, and land, meaning territory. Essentially, a land set apart. Early uses of this term suggest lands divided by rivers or tidal waves, which immediately brings to mind the hotel in Silent Hill, physically separated from the town and the site of James's revelation. The town itself is also literally fragmented across dimensions, reinforcing its status as a space removed from the ordinary world. The separation operates on multiple levels. The town is isolated by the lake, James's sense of self and memory is also fractured, And his relationship with Mary is defined by emotional distance. When you consider all of the context, the surname conveys way more than just physical isolation. It's reasonable to ask why a character would be split into apparent binaries in a game that so clearly embraces liminality and the in-between. After all, what initially drew me to Silent Hill 2 was precisely this gray area, where characters are not cleanly defined as good or evil, where the town itself resembles a kind of purgatory, and where meaning is intentionally left unresolved. Even when the game presents a split, such as Mary and Maria, the two are not simple opposites. Instead, they function as overlapping states, with meaning existing in the space between them. Look at it through a Western Abrahamic lens, however, like we've been doing for much of this video essay. Classical religious dualism frames reality in strict binaries: good versus evil, right versus wrong, sacred versus profane. Within such systems, ambiguity is often treated as a threat. Anything that falls outside the category of good is easily cast as bad, wrong, or corrupt. This logic is visible even in the historical use of the term pagan. Contrary to popular belief, the word did not originally describe a unified belief system, nor was it a label people used for themselves. It was introduced by early Christians as a catch-all term for beliefs and practices that were simply not Christian. Paganism, as it is commonly understood today, is largely a Christian construct, a category of the other used to define Christianity through opposition. This, once again, creates a rigid binary that collapses vastly different belief systems into a single opposing force, erasing nuance and leaving little room for interpretation, debate, or moral complexity. Silent Hill 2, though, resists rigid moral dualism while also relying on its familiarity. Most players, whether religious or not, are used to thinking in clear moral binaries because Western culture emphasizes them. The game initially encourages that kind of thinking, only to challenge it later on. Rather than offering simple answers, it lingers in that in-between space, between guilt and innocence, love and violence, punishment and understanding. James Sunderland, no matter what people say on the forums, is not simply good or evil. He exists between identities. His very name reflects this, a land and a self set apart, yet he cannot fully inhabit that space. He constantly forces his experiences into black and white categories, clinging to dualistic thinking as a way to contain his confusion and pain. Maria exists, I would argue, because James cannot express hatred nor sexual desire towards Mary. But that doesn't make those feelings any less real. Unable to hold these contradictions within himself, he splits them into separate figures. This is most obvious in his Madonna-Whore complex and in his inability to accept both his guilt and the emotional reality that drove his actions in the first place. The possibility of him existing somewhere in between is exactly what he, and also many players, cannot face. You can also look at this name, as we did with Shepherd, in a more textual sense rather than just metaphorically. When you hear a land set apart, heaven or hell might come to mind first, but there is a more specific connection here, called the cities of refuge. In the Old Testament, God designed 6 cities through Moses where someone who had killed another person unintentionally, or manslaughter, could flee for safety. These cities protected the individual from revenge, particularly from the Avenger of Blood, which was usually a family member of the deceased, while still allowing justice to take its course. Only those who had killed accidentally were allowed refuge. Premeditated murder disqualified them. The accused had to remain in the city until the death of the high priest. Leaving early left them vulnerable to vengeance. While inside, they are fully protected. These cities were literally separated from ordinary towns, with defined boundaries and special rules that marked them as distinct spaces. Just as the cities of refuge shielded the innocent from danger while imposing order on a chaotic moral and legal world, Silent Hill separates James from the ordinary world, creating a psychologically and morally charged space where he must confront his guilt. It's a morally gray space, much like the biblical cities themselves. And Silent Hill, it's also gray because of the fog. When we consider Silent Hill through this lens, it makes sense why all the game's protagonists are drawn there. Each has experienced trauma and committed acts that weigh heavily on their conscience. Navigating their own version of the town becomes a way of assessing guilt, almost like a personal city of refuge. Something also worth noting is that during the War of 1812, Silent Hill was resettled by the US as a penal colony, where the prison was constructed. A penal colony is not what it sounds like. It's a remote settlement used to exile prisoners, separate them from society, and often use them for forced labor in distant territories. Sounds kind of familiar, but I'm getting off topic here. Sex. And boy, am I excited to talk about this. Remember I mentioned Freud earlier? Many of his theories seem rooted in his own preoccupations with his male sexuality, particularly Oedipal and castration anxieties. Considering he thought women had penis envy, though, I think he just had an unhealthy and intense fondness of his own. Regardless of his own psychoanalysis, if we conflate Mary with a Madonna, making her a motherly figure, James would then struggle with a kind of Oedipal complex, which Freud claimed could increase castration anxieties, since theoretically the father might cut off genitalia in retaliation if he found out about this attraction. From a Freudian perspective then, Pyramid Head might not just represent James's guilt, it could also embody his castration anxiety. After all, he is a larger, more powerful man, wielding a weapon capable of cutting off any part of James's body. Pyramid Head's design is also significant and worth closer examination. Many players link it to the gallows inscription found earlier in Silent Hill 2, which appears to foreshadow the game's final confrontation, two executioners standing over a condemned man. This visual parallel strongly supports the idea that Pyramid Head is rooted in the symbolism of punishment and execution. Later entries in the series expand on this imagery through Valtiel, a figure associated with the cult's execution rites. In Silent Hill 3, a photograph depicts two executioners wearing ceremonial robes, reinforcing the executioner archetype that Pyramid Head definitely represents. However, Valtiel himself does not possess a pyramid-shaped head. Instead, he wears this fleshy, hood-like mask with overtly fetishistic undertones. This means to me that Pyramid Head is not literally a reincarnation of Valtiel, but rather a personalized interpretation of the executioner archetype that James possibly encountered, seeing religious imagery during his earlier visit to Silent Hill with Mary, which his mind later reassembled in the form of Pyramid Head. Developer commentary supports this distinction. Pyramid Head is unique to James Sunderland and exists as a manifestation of his guilt and desire for punishment. If Pyramid Head is such a strong symbol of executioner, then why is he so sexy? I mean, no. Why does he do so much sex? No. Why are so many of his actions sexualized? When you look at it through the Freudian lens, though, it makes a lot more sense. Freud argued that castration anxiety is closely tied to the fear of death and annihilation of the self, allowing sexual violence and execution to function as symbolic equivalents. Pyramid Head's brutality can therefore be read as a convergence of James's fear of death, judgment, and his sexual guilt, making Pyramid Head an enemy willing to cut off either one of James's heads. This interpretation, I think, also is further supported by the fact that Pyramid Head's silhouette resembles a grotesque, exaggerated abstraction of male genitalia. He kind of looks like a pen 15 if you catch my drift. Following Freud's framework, Pyramid Head could also represent his father, technically, I guess, coming to castrate him for liking someone that is kind of motherly in nature, but I'm not as comfortable as Freud picturing James sword fighting with a suspiciously shaped manifestation of his father, so we're going to focus on the surprisingly less disturbing topic of castration instead. Castration is something that actually appears in another one of our characters' stories. Angela is the last person we see before our final battle with Pyramid Head and confrontation with Mary. On the walls behind her are the castrated bodies of what we can assume to be her father and brother who were her abusers. The developers had confirmed that Abstract Daddy looked different for Angela as it did for James, so while we might be peeking into Angela's story and something that literally happened to her, what James sees could potentially be different and related to his own psyche and fears in the same way that Abstract Daddy is different for them. Eddie, on the other hand, is a character that is driven by completely different impulses, seemingly having no problem with his lack of sexual life. Rather, he is overtaken by gluttony, yes, but also violence. I would say Eddie is the most prone to violence out of the three characters, with the slabs of meat around his fight not only representing hunger, but hunting, too. So we have one character whose story is defined by sexual violence, and another by aggressive violence, and then a third who seems to have a mix of both. When considering this, there's one more Freudian theory that I want to look at. If you took an intro to psychology class, you might have learned about Freud's id, ego, and superego. The id wants pleasure, and the superego demands morality. The ego negotiates between them to function in reality. Pyramid Head can be read as the physical manifestation of James's id, the unconscious source of bodily needs, impulses, and desires, especially those tied to sexual drive and aggression. The id is also completely unconscious, according to Freud, by the act of repression, which is essentially James's last name. The id operates according to the pleasure principle, and Pyramid Head consistently behaves in ways that reflect this. When we first encounter Pyramid Head, he's acting on the sexual impulse, one we know James has been repressing. Later, he kills Maria, an act of violence that mirrors James's own real-life aggression. In both cases, Pyramid Head is unconcerned with the morality or consequences. He is focused solely on the satisfaction of instinctual drives, exactly as the id would be. If that's the case, this would answer the question of why there are two Pyramid Heads. They may represent the id split into its two dominant urges, sexual desire and aggression. While both figures display elements of each, one can be read as primarily sexual, with Pyramid Head leaving James alone in the closet simply to pursue another woman, while the other embodies aggression, seen by targeting Maria and ultimately killing her. If Pyramid Head is not read as the id, another strong interpretation is that he represents Freud's life drive, or eros, and death drive, thanatos. Eros refers to the instincts tied to survival, reproduction, and pleasure, operating under the pleasure principle once again. Thanatos, by contrast, is the unconscious drive towards death, expressed through self-destruction behavior, aggression, and a pull towards destruction, and a return to an inorganic state. Freud also linked Thanatos to repetition compulsion, the tendency to unconsciously relive traumatic experiences rather than resolve them, which is basically what James is doing over and over again in Silent Hill. The eggs that we receive after Pyramid Head's fight also point to this, surprisingly. The colors of the eggs are scarlet and rust, evoking the images of both Maria and Mary. Scarlet is not only a color that can represent lust and infidelity, think the Scarlet Letter, but it also symbolizes life and resurrection. One of the ways I know that these represent the two Marys is the story that's known by the Orthodox Church, where Mary Magdalene presented an egg to Emperor Tiberius, proclaiming Christ is risen. The emperor scoffed that this was as impossible as the egg turning red, whereupon it miraculously turned scarlet, symbolizing Christ's resurrection and new life. This is a story that's actually linked to the origin of Easter eggs. One is tied to the life drive, which is Maria, and the other tied to the death drive, which is Mary. So his death drive, Pyramid Head number 1, gives him the ability to resurrect and start the cycle again. This connection, I think, becomes even stronger when considering that Thanatos is both the Greek personification of death and in the title of the song that plays during the In Water ending, where James fully gives in to the death drive, where James drives to his death. Utilizing the death drive. Do you get it? The developers have stated that there is no single canon ending and that all endings can be considered valid. This suggests that James may be trapped in a cycle of repetition, compulsion, reliving his most traumatic memories in Silent Hill, repressing them, and beginning again rather than ever truly escaping them. A fight constantly against his life and death drives, killing both, and ultimately being left somewhere in between.